73 seconds. That's how long Space Shuttle Challenger lasted on the morning of January 28th, 1986. 7 crew members, a teacher from New Hampshire, half of the country watching live, including classrooms full of children who had been told this was the day space became normal. It did not become normal. What destroyed Challenger was not complex. It was a rubber seal, an O-ring about the thickness of a pencil, sitting in a joint between 2 sections of a solid rocket booster. In warm weather, the ring compressed and sealed the joint. In cold weather, it lost elasticity, shrank away from the metal, and left a gap. Hot gas passed through, then fire, then everything. The temperature at launch was 36 degrees. Engineers had warned NASA the night before. They had data. They had charts. They had a specific written recommendation: do not launch. NASA launched anyway. And when people ask how something like this happens, how a known flaw kills 7 people on live television, the answer is not complicated. It's just hard to accept. Nobody made one terrible decision. An entire institution made 1,000 reasonable ones. The Space Shuttle was never what it was sold as. NASA pitched it to Congress as a reusable spacecraft that would fly frequently, cheaply, and routinely. Like an airliner to orbit, 50 flights a year. The economics would justify the costs. The Air Force signed on. Satellite companies signed on. The shuttle would carry everything. The reality was different. The shuttle was expensive. Turnaround between flights was measured in months, not days. Each mission required an army of technicians. The thermal tiles alone needed individual hand inspection after every re-entry. By the mid-1980s, NASA was flying in 9 missions a year and struggling to keep that pace. The solid rocket boosters, the 2 white columns flanking the orange fuel tank, were the most powerful components of the shuttle stack. Each one stood 12 stories tall and burned 6 tons of propellant per second. They could not be throttled. They could not be shut down. Once ignited, they burned until they were empty. Each booster was shipped in 4 segments from a factory in Utah and assembled at the Kennedy Space Center. The joints where those segments met were sealed by 2 rubber O-rings, one primary, one backup, pressed into grooves in the steel casing. When the booster ignited, internal pressure was supposed to push the O-rings harder into their seats, tightening the seal. That was the design. In practice, the joints flexed on ignition. The O-rings had a fraction of a second to seat before combustion gases reached them, and the colder the rubber, the slower it moved. Roger Boisjoly was a seal specialist at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the boosters. In January 1987, a full year before the disaster, he examined a recovered booster from a cold-weather launch and found something that alarmed him. Hot combustion gas had blown past the primary O-ring and charred the secondary. Both rings showed erosion. The backup seal, the last line between the crew and a catastrophic burn-through, had nearly failed. Boisjoly wrote a memo to his management. The language was not subtle. He described the potential for a catastrophe of the highest order, involving loss of human life. He recommended that no shuttle fly until the joint design was fixed. Thiokol formed a task force. It met sporadically. Resources were limited. The shuttle kept flying. Over the next 12 months, engineers documented O-ring damage on multiple flights. The pattern was clear and consistent. The colder the temperature at launch, the worse the erosion. Every data point told the same story. Cold made the seals slow. Slow seals leaked. Leaks meant hot gas where hot gas should never be. None of this was secret. NASA had the data. Thiokol had the data. The problem had been discussed in formal reviews, documented in memos, raised in meetings. It was a known issue, categorized, tracked, and gradually accepted. Each flight that launched with O-ring damage and returned safely made the next launch with O-ring damage feel slightly more normal. Sociologist Diane Vaughan would later give this phenomenon a name, the normalization of deviance. The threshold of what counts as acceptable shifts, flight by flight, until the unacceptable becomes routine. January 27, 1986. The forecast for launch morning called for temperatures in the low 20s. Thiokol engineers were alarmed. They had never launched below 53 degrees. Their coldest previous launch had produced the worst O-ring damage they had ever seen. Now NASA was proposing to launch almost 20 degrees colder than that. A teleconference was arranged that evening. Thiokol engineers in Utah, NASA managers at Kennedy and Marshall Space Flight Centers, Boisjoly and his colleague Arnie Thompson presented the data. Their recommendation was unambiguous. Do not launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. NASA's response was unlike anything the engineers had experienced. Lawrence Malloy, the solid rocket booster project manager at Marshall, said he was, quote, appalled, unquote, by the recommendation. Another NASA manager reportedly said, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" Thiokol's management asked for a 5-minute caucus off the phone from NASA. It lasted 30 minutes. In that room, the engineering recommendation was overridden by management. Senior Vice President Joe Kilminster returned to the line and told NASA that Thiokol now recommended launch. Boisjoly and Thompson were devastated. Boisjoly later testified that he went home that night knowing people were going to die and being unable to do anything about it. The morning of January 28th was the coldest launch in shuttle history. Ice hung from the launch pad gantry. The temperature at the O-ring joints was estimated at 28 degrees. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern, the solid rocket boosters ignited. Within the first second, hot gas blew past both O-rings on the right booster aft field joint. Puffs of smoke were visible on the launch footage, 8 of them, one for each rotation of the booster as it left the pad. For a moment, combustion residue temporarily sealed the breach. The shuttle climbed. 40 seconds. 50 seconds. Then wind shear at altitude flexed the booster casing. The temporary seal broke. A plume of flame appeared on the side of the right booster, aimed directly at the external fuel tank. At 73 seconds, the external tank ruptured. The shuttle broke apart at 48,000 feet and Mach 1.92. The crew cabin separated intact and continued upward for another 25 seconds before falling into the Atlantic Ocean. All 7 crew members died. Christa McAuliffe, the teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who was supposed to broadcast a lesson from space, never made it to orbit. President Reagan appointed a commission. Among its members was Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist. During a televised hearing, Feynman took a piece of O-ring rubber, clamped it in a C-clamp, and dropped it into a glass of ice water. When he removed the clamp, the rubber did not spring back. It stayed compressed, rigid. In front of the cameras, in 10 seconds, he had demonstrated that NASA had known for years and launched through anyway. The Commission's report identified the O-ring failure as the physical cause and NASA's decision-making culture as the institutional cause. The shuttle program was grounded for 32 months. The joint design was rebuilt. Management structures were reformed. Feynman appended his own addendum to the report. His conclusion was 9 words. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Roger Boisjoly never recovered professionally. He became a vocal advocate for engineering ethics and spent the rest of his career lecturing on responsibility of engineers to refuse unsafe directives. He was shunned by colleagues at Thiokol for speaking publicly. He testified, he kept speaking. He died in 2012. The shuttle flew again. It flew for another 17 years. In 2003, Columbia disintegrated during re-entry. Foam insulation had struck the wing during launch and breached the thermal protection system. 7 more crew members died. The cause was different. The institutional failure was almost identical. A known risk, documented, discussed, and gradually accepted until it killed people. 2 shuttles, 14 lives. Both times, the engineers who raised concerns were right. Both times, they were overruled. Both times, the institution had every piece of information it needed to prevent the disaster and chose schedule over safety. The Challenger didn't explode because of a rubber seal. It exploded because an organization with the information to prevent a catastrophe convinced itself, one flight at a time, that the catastrophe wasn't coming. That's the thing about system failures. The warning is almost never missing. It is almost always ignored.